the principle of individuation. Now what's that? If everything in the universe is composed of these building blocks, trees, gooseberries, people, see, everything in the universe composed of these, what is it and where does it take place that there are individual things? See, that sounds weird, but that's not weird. Why are there individual trees and individual people and individual arms and individual... See, how is it that the gene, on the gene code, you have to put it under electronic microscope, how does it know where the left hand is? How does it know where the eye belongs? How does it know where your right little toe goes? Highly complex rationality got them someplace. It just seems to know where... It's like the stomach. The human stomach, see, has acid in it for digestive purposes that should dissolve protein lining of the stomach. Except what? It does not, because it has buffers. Golly, if you're getting evolution going here, you wouldn't have any stomachs to get buffers for. How many millions of years would you have all this corrective process? Well, the gene itself just unfolding. How does this get here? How does it know it? Well, I'm not trying to personify a gene. Well, see, that you ought to be able to have a revival. See, a telescope and a high school explanation of a gene. See, ought to cause drunkards, alcoholics, dope addicts, see, to repent and come to God. See? Now the principle of, now notice that's an abstract. What is it that causes individuals? If all reality is multiplicity, see? What is it that causes it? The Greeks had no explanation. See? Now just put that down because that'll persist all through. The principle, and in logic, you see we have the principle of identity. Law of excluded middle, law of contradiction, and the law of identity. If nothing in the universe is identical, then rationality collapses. Even elementary school textbooks said every snowflake is different. Well, specialists in crystal formation, see, it's the universality of crystal formation that gives the explanatory power. See, there's universality in everything, everywhere. See, from the smallest thing to the largest thing. But the principle here, and then space is plenum. Is that an odd phrase for people? That's not just standard talk. You don't have conversation in most of your classes about space is plenum. Now, the Greeks asked this. That is, space that bodies move in, is space real? See, is space something beside? Do you see space? See, motion takes place in space. The Greeks had no theory of space. And I have a couple of very important books on space and time. I don't know whether I gave it to you, but you need to look. It's all about the gospel, by the way. It's all about the truth of the gospel. So space as a plenum, that means, is space something independent of what exists? See, what do you minimally, commonsensically know about these? Just commonsensically.
Location.
Location. You know they are distinct because they're not in the same place. Well, what are you going to do with particles that no one can see? See, they're high-speed negative integer numbers. Who's seen them? No one. Do they exist? Or are these just kind of created things in the laboratory for graduate students to work on? No? Well, whatever else you know about these, you know they're not the same because they're separate. Commonsensically is all I said. They're separated by space. So minimally, without knowing a thing of what's in them, you know they're not the same. Same what? Same anything, because they're different. But they have some common ground. Now, space, that seems odd. We'll talk more about space in the weeks to come. But this unity and diversity and the one in a many, do you remember that from, well, you weren't in that, but freshman IDS? It drove freshmen crazy for 12 years after 3 cycles of IDS. Couldn't figure out why one in a many had any relevance in the world. All it has to do was the very foundation of thought. Other than that, it had no relevance whatsoever. How do you have experience of multiplicity of things and assume what Kant called the unity of apperception, the transcendental unity of apperception? Kant was assuming that every person that looked at the world saw the same world. Well, from the 19th century to the 20th century, every looker has a different... See, we're into perspectivalism. But see, it's only at the break in the 19th century that any rational person in the Western world ever assumed that there was anything but universal rationality, universal explanation. And it was a matter of whether you understood it or not. Well, when the social sciences come in and give us a little contextualization and give us the pluralism business, well, you see, you're on the way of operating worldviews out of sociology rather than out of physics. Well, it's not false that we have to deal with sociology, but I would say sociology is not the historic origin of science. And psychology is not the historic origin of science. And cultural anthropology is not the historic origin of science. But I can tell you historically what is. Unless you want to rewrite history, you could do that. We've had people do those things. But as it stands in the record, it's not an accident that the social sciences came into existence almost 100 years after the method was intact. You see, the reductionism, there's to be nothing but social structures are just like material structures. Well, that's an assumption, isn't it? That isn't a self-evident claim. You still hear it and see it in books today. It's not antiquated. Now, right here, the locus of potency, potentiality. Now, that sounds like Aristotle. Actuality and potentiality. What a thing is, it has potentiality to become something else. But you see, actuality and potentiality, see, a given thing does not have potency to become something that it had no essence for. See, a horse will not become an elephant. But evolution, you see, this goes kaput with evolution. Okay? So the locus of potentiality. Does every entity in the world have capacity to be something else? Now, once this Greek view in our class in the Christian faith and biological theories, here's what happened. The Greek theory of biology, see, act and potentiality in matter and form. But see, form had an ontology, potentiality, but they never explained what was it that caused this actuality to have potentiality, where the potentiality came from. See, Greek metaphysics couldn't possibly be evolutionary, in spite of the fact that technical papers are still written that Aristotle was an evolutionist. It would violate the entire structure of his metaphysics for that to be the case. See, entelechy, hierarchy of being, precluded evolution in Aristotelian terms. So only when that worldview comes apart is evolution set in the West. See, and it's over these questions the Greeks answered, where the locus, that means where is potentiality? Not what causes it, but where is it? The locus of it means where is its location? See, where is the locus of potentiality of a rock to fall? Does a rock, an inanimate object, have potentiality to fall? Only if it is rationally placed in circumstances to fall. Well, we already got, it's like historically in chemistry, we got what kind of chemistry broadly? Classical, organic, and inorganic. What was that kind of talk for? Because you had non-living systems and living systems, but by the time the whole evolutionary view took over, that was just an arbitrary distinction for freshmen and sophomore chemistry classes. Because if there is no inorganic, it's just a different form of matter and energy. See, because energy is alive. Motion, we keep it alive all the way through the Copenhagen quantum mechanics. Motion, it's all, what causes motion? What causes a caterpillar to be a butterfly? What causes certain species of of caterpillars. They're shipping them down to eat up cocoa beans. They're not going to do that till we have the Third World War on our hands. But what causes that? Well, you have to ask the people who know those species and what those species like to eat. So there seems to be structure in the universe. Anything that's done actually seems like it's doable any place. See, culture doesn't set why certain species of caterpillars like cocoa leaves. If there is a science of it, you can explain why they do, and that's part of the chemistry of their system. Okay? So, now watch. Explanation, universality, unity, one in the many. How do you unify the many experiences? See, this is not rationalism versus empiricism, but empiricism only gives you the many. Empiricism can never give you the one. Empiricism can never unify thought. And the last effort to do that was the Vienna Circle. And Kuhn's book, the monograph, that thousands of you aren't reading, was to be published in that series. And the thesis of Kuhn's book about revolution was a total repudiation of every other paper, every other monograph in that encyclopedia that the University of Chicago never finished. That book called in question every fundamental assumption in all the other papers. What was it? That there is a universal method, and we have that method, and we can explain anything that's real in the universe. And Kuhn, see, threw that thesis of paradigmatic revolution in the face of the positivistic model of science. I can't imagine them not realizing what was in this thing. I don't know whether they did or not. I don't psychoanalyze dead people. I would encourage you not to psychoanalyze living ones, but some people have nothing more to do. And you can't refute it much, so hop to it. Now, it could always be, you could always make up something, and certainly couldn't be refuted. So if that's proof, I guess. Prove to me it's wrong. Now, then, here's the thing. There are defects. These are common sense remarks of the Greeks. There are defects in living systems. There's defects in things. And they notice that the lands wash, water, the form of power, movement. They didn't have any scientific explanation. We don't have geology, among the Greeks, but they were commonsensically aware of some basic things of change. And they had even talked of this. Now, how could Greek naturalism talk about life as an ontologically distinct from matter? Because the Greeks knew that if there is no life or mind distinct from matter, there is no discussion of the rationality of the universe. But 20th century reductionism goes right on asking explanatory questions, and they've lost their minds. I mean, technically. Just like person in the social sciences. The social sciences have generally wiped out the person. The only thing that's lost in the social sciences is what a person is. It seems to be a great loss. It's a reductionism from a method that doesn't reduce. It's a reductionism. Now, these are Greek common sense questions. Now, here's the technical problem. This is slightly technical. This late at night, in particular, if you ate heavily, if you had filet mignon or ate in the cafeteria, ate salted nails or something like that. Here's the whole problem about the one and the many. The Greeks, these are Greek questions. The ultimate subject of predication. What is it that language is talking about when it talks about matter? What is it in the world that language is talking about when it discusses matter or motion? See, in predication, this is the foundation of subject-object epistemology. We talked about it a little bit, just mentioned it once or twice in epistemology class. You remember that? See, this is the fountainhead. When we lose subject-object epistemology, you're collapsing rationality. Okay? See, Buddhism and Hinduism, Eastern metaphysics coming into science. Why? Because they've collapsed subject-object. But see, they're operating on Hegel's misunderstanding of subject-object. Hegel thought that every knowing subject came to know an object to control it. Well, if that's necessarily the case, then to know God as subject-object, see, See, human subject knowing God as an object, made God into an object. God is not an object. He is a subject. See, if you make a human being into an object for scrutiny in the laboratory, you've made that person into an object. You've already reduced something that you've lost what makes them unique. Just the procedure. But when anybody loses subject-object epistemology, you've lost language. Does that make sense? See, a subject is predicating something. Does matter exist? Does unity exist? Where does it exist? It's abstract, isn't it? Why, empiricism can't stand abstractions. But without abstractions, there is no rationality, and there is no what? No understanding. Understanding is the mind's capacity to abstract. But no one's ever seen an abstraction. No one's ever seen such. But the mind's propensity abstracts from. And what saved Aristotle, see, from this mess, he said that the intellect abstracts universals from particulars. Now, he had no evidence for that. He just had the need for that to be the case. I have no experience of the intellect abstracting universals out of particulars. But Aristotle and all classical Greek thinkers knew without universals there is no rational explanation of anything. Not merely science, but of anything. Because all we have without abstraction are particulars. And then we would need a word for every particular. This would collapse society. This would collapse communication. You see the ramification? Well, communication isn't collapsed, and science or society isn't collapsed over that reason anyway. But you lose a social community in communication when everybody means different things by words. God, Bible. When everybody means different things, it's like Alice in Blunderland. That when I use a word, why, it means what I say it means. Well, that was just bamboozling the empiricist. You don't arbitrarily make up meanings of words. Now you can if you want to do fiction. You can say anything you want. But in ordinary community of conversation, every user of a language doesn't have a private meaning on words. And no child ever learns and imposes private meanings on words from grandpa and grandma and people that they learn from. They only learn that later when they go to school to undercut education. See? You go to school to destroy education. Now, life, mind, deity. Now, Plato talked about theos, and Aristotle talked about theos, and some of the Greeks didn't. But see, theos is not a person. Theos is a principle of rationality. So though Plato and Aristotle have God, see, even gods, but they're only abstractions, not persons.
And that's why you have the loss of language in person.
Mm-hmm. Now, ultimate subject, predicate, subject-object breakdown. And here's the problem. The transition from matter to mechanics, because the Greeks made the effort to move beyond, and that's where we've been for a couple of weeks. The Greeks made the effort to break out of mere motion, but the free fall, Aristotle's theory of free fall that we mentioned, freely falling body. This is the end of this. The end of merely commonsensical description of motion and giving a mechanical explanation for why bodies fall. Do all bodies fall alike? The Greek judgment, and that's where Galileo and Kepler and Newton take up. Aristotle's theory of free fall, that the heavier a body, faster it falls. As a matter of fact, that's not true. See, but this is the end of this. See, the explanation. And you have to read Aristotle's physics and Aristotle's astronomy. But the Greeks were struggling with explanation, rationality, universality, but gave no foundation for advancing thought. The best the Greeks could do is to pass that explanation on from generation to generation. That's the best they could do. because the explanation didn't explain anything except to those that were in the paradigm, but it never and could never produce new information. Bang! When a new method comes, it has to break with this method to get any new information available. Now, information means, as Popper says, we get information out of ignorance. That sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? How do we get truth from error? Now, I don't mean pragmatism or mere trial and error, but the whole history of these efforts are failures. Who is it or what is it that recognizes that they're failures? Why, the human mind. It's the human mind that recognizes that. And it looks like some human minds have the propensity, they just won't sit still until they get some kind of satisfactory resolution of that problem. Now, some just get indolency and just say, well, whatever you say is okay.
It's usually the human mind that, when like the scientific revolution, would create a new instrument that would bring new data.
Now, so we've got to account for new data. This could never get new data. And when it started in astronomy, it was an observation of an eclipse. That is the historic origin of philosophical discussion. Trying to explain why an eclipse occurred. And the astronomical charts of the Greeks, why other eclipses had occurred. See, they had no explanation, but they were searching for explanation. They knew that this was not commonsensical experience. So the search for universal explanatory power, but they failed in that.
Or would they just say that the gods were responsible?
Well, some, but not the philosophers. See, the shift from mythology to the philosophically critical mind is what this would represent. Okay.
And that
so,
started with Socrates?
Well, Socrates, he devised a methodology to attempt to resolve when propositions are about the same thing, that if they contradict one another, how does the mind resolve the conflict? This is what's called dialectic in Socratic logic. That means that the mind cannot accept contradictory. By the time we get to Hegel and evolution, though, see, the mind just accepts contradictory things as part of reality. Well, I have no doubt that contradictory things do exist in this world. No doubt. But that's not the source of explanation of anything. In fact, if there's no truth, I would have no basis for knowing what a contradiction is. I wouldn't even know what it is that's being said. Okay. Well, these are just quite elementary, but these are abstract. These are abstract principles. Now, this is about motion. These are Greek words that are used in the scientific textbook. It's all about motion, and the essence of motion is change. Why do things change? Scott.
I didn't have the epistemology class. I'm a little unclear on what the distinction between subject and object.
Well, the knowing subject, a person.
Okay.
Now here,
rationality.
Just commonsensically, we wouldn't say here are two rocks. There's rock 1 and rock 2, and rock 1 wants to know about rock 2.
Okay.
I don't have any way of carrying that very far, but we have a person. See, person 1 and rock 1. The person asks a question about the rock. The rock doesn't ask a question about.
So
see, it's like animals. Animals don't ask for explanation. That's why animals replicate. They do the same thing generation after generation, and that species is limited. And you can say, well, porpoise speak, and they're getting, my porpoise has a 500-word vocabulary. Well, it's a highly dubious claim. And as soon as we get a Harvard education, then that rascal, that fool will, show you that we're on the way to man again. So a person asks, well, what's the unique thing? The Greeks have no explanation, but the Greeks were naturalists, they were materialists, they were non-creationists, but they knew if there's no mind, nous, if there's no pneuma, notice, those are different ontologies. It shows up in the mind-body problem. Then it shows up in the mental-physical. If everything is reduced to physical explanation, then mind doesn't exist. As independent, and that's over the mind-brain, the computer. You hear that coming? Wipe out the whole Christian paradigm. So we ought to have some kind addressing of that problem. So look at this classical, these very simple statements, but if you want just a very helpful, very important, Harold Johnson's Three Ancient Meanings of Matter, Democritus, Plato, and Aristotle, in the Journal of History of Ideas, Volume 28, 1967, 3 through 16. You can come and look at that later. That's a helpful place. You can't read thousands of pages to find out some direction for some. So I put up useful articles on or will, if I haven't, on all major concepts. But this is a very important, informed, and textually oriented three ancient meanings of matter. So Democritus meant one thing, Plato meant another, and Aristotle meant another. Okay. And Democritus was the head of the physics department at the University of Athens. Plato and Aristotle never taught, but they taught the world. They never had a job, but they taught the world. But when you don't have a job and you want to teach the world, you do have something to teach it. You do need something to teach it, not just the aspiration to teach. So anyway, it's a very important article. Look for things in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, brief articles, Journal of History of Ideas. And that journal came into being, Dr. Boaz at Johns Hopkins University, assuming that the whole universe stems from just ideas. Ideas are important. In fact, ideas have feet. But American pragmatism, see, doesn't give too much credence to ideas, but pragmatism is an idea. The odd thing about that. It's not a good one, but it is an idea. Now, that's helpful. So if you say, hey, I need a few pages, I can't read 500 pages if I gave them to you, but this is a helpful thing about three classical alternative viewpoints. But Aristotle won the day. And Aristotle not only won the day in classical Greek, Aristotle won the day. Plato and Aristotle came in the Christian tradition, which is most important for what we're doing. See, without understanding Plato and Aristotle, you can't possibly effectively deal with church history up to the Reformation, including the Reformation. Then without Kant and Hegel, you can't understand the next 200 years. And so you're just wiping out any possibility of interpretive schemas. So these are assumptions about, now, physical reality, if all that exists is physical, matter, then what about God? What about miracle? What about God's action within history? Well, you see, there is no God that acts within history. There is no God that acts. How could God act? The question that's asked at this time and the Middle Ages was, is action at a distance possible? Action at a distance possible. It's only in 20th century developments of science that it seemed even reasonable to talk about action at a distance. Can you cause something to happen causally disconnected from that? Well, if you can't, then God can't create. You hear it? Action at a distance. Does a thing have to, can you fix your car at a distance if it breaks down? Can you build a house at a distance? Well, common sense, it looks like we have no reason to assume that any action, any motion can be at a distance. There has to be some way that we are causally connected to cause things. You write papers at a distance? Well, see, if there is no action, we have evidence of action at a distance, but if there is no action at a distance, God certainly couldn't have created it. So it's devastating if it seems impractical. That's why most people's gods is really a figment of their imagination that they keep alive in 19th century revivalistic, individualistic songs.
This comes out of the idea of
we'll have a little break
the
in
inanimate and the animate.
Yes. But see, the Greeks, though they were naturalists, see, their problem was ontologically. Why were they posited vocabulary like spirit, like God, like mind? Well, because matter was not self-explanatory. Well, then I would give up naturalism. Naturalism cannot posit two ontologies. This is what happens later with the monism dualism, dilemma. Once materialism gains the Western mindset over science, if materialism is the case, clearly there's no mind or spirit or Holy Spirit or nothing spiritual about man. So morals goes, worship goes, see, prayer goes. You see all the things that go. So even the practical ministry can't survive, see, if these issues are not responded to.
So because their worldview couldn't explain the things they saw, so they...
Right. But they're searching for common sense. See, this is purely arbitrary to say everything is composed of earth. See, they had no idea what earth was composed of, or what was happening chemically with fire. They didn't know. They had fire, but they didn't know what it was. So when we get science, we get the periodic chart, we begin seeing valence, how elements are interfaced and how they can mix and what can't and what can't. Well, then you start getting an explanation. Other than that, it's just guessing. And 1 in 10 million times, see, you could guess, and then you become the prophet, see? And then you keep guessing for another million times, if you can live so long. We'll have a little break. Now, I want you to just take this, not with a grain of salt, but these are the things, the essence of classical Greek thought, searching for one in a many, universal in particular, for explanation in the scientific realm. And in astronomy, the Greeks did epicyclical because they were assuming ontologically that all reality that moved had to move in a circle because the circle was perfect. Now that is neat talk. But you see, when they find out that the planets don't move in a circle, they couldn't explain that. Well, they couldn't explain it before. But see, in philosophical terms, since the circle was perfect and the heavenly laws were perfect, they knew it had to. You notice how easy it is. All the things we know for sure might be deductions from what it is that's not so sure. So if you can come back, take a minute and a half and just have a lot of fun and come back in. Oh, here, I'll show you these books. This is a helpful book. I brought you the large book, but there's new articles in this. It was not in that large book on the history concept of matter. And next time, I mentioned this before, when I have to come to Genesis and geology. Yeah, those are all the books. That's an important book.
There you go. Stuff you want.
Oh, right. Okay, thank you.
I've got to run.
I got you.
You got to go to Chicago tomorrow.
Be careful.
In 2 weeks.
Yeah, I got my
You should have a hat.
Oh, do it. I won't frame that. I will take part of next time. Come on in, John. You all right? I want you to see this material. We can't continue to recover this. I'll bring you tools, or I have tools in my material on Cartesian physics and Descartes' effort, and he is the historic origin in physics of materialism. And it goes right, and Hobbes was the first philosopher to attempt a completely materialistic explanation of economics and politics, a whole worldview on the basis of materialism, Hobbes. But it came to Cartesian. Yet Descartes, he was a Catholic, practicing Catholic. And yet his philosophy of physics generated materialism. And he didn't aim to do that, but it also didn't advance physics. But we need to understand why it didn't. It didn't just because people didn't like him, it's just because it wasn't correct. So we'll get these two giant brothers just a minute here. But the problem of change, rejection of matter form. Now this happens to be Greek metaphysics, essence and existence. Now if you know something about existentialism in the 20th century, it's always in existence man creates his essence. So this is the whole foundation of human potential movement that opens the door for New Age. It came to existentialism, and not only, but specifically Jean-Paul Sartre and the existentialists of the 50s and 60s. And not a little by Kierkegaard, though Kierkegaard was theoretically a Christian. But it moved, you see, this is over against the whole classical paradigm of explaining the essence of an object, but essence was abstract. And the essence is worked out in existence. But the inversion that in existence, man creates his own essence. So you had to have freedom concept fused with a complete break with classical ontology, metaphysics. Because from the Greeks, the Bible, forward, there was structure, and the structure could never be violated. That's why you don't have an evolutionary viewpoint. But an evolutionary viewpoint, which is essential for existentialism, moves from existence to essence. It is the the self, and that's why you have the rise and fall of the self. The finite self replaces the absolute self from Descartes forward in Western thought. The self is God, and the finite self becomes the ordering principle through method, through mathematics, through science, that science no longer and math no longer needs to be grounded in the infinite self of the Creator.
I guess thinking of Hegel with the influence he had, how it doesn't make any sense if the finite self was ordering everything and he talks about the absolute.
Well, the absolute Geist, though, is always out in the future. See, all theology is a hope, and all futurology, all the answers are out in the future. There are no answers in the past. See, that metaphysic from Hegel and Darwin forward, this is death to any form of conservatism or affirming that anything in the Bible is once and for all given to the saints. See, nothing in the past is final, except it's gone. Its death is all that's final. So this whole is a worldview. It's a paradigm shift. It's not merely some different thought. See, it's a completely different approach. So all forms of conservatism are collapsed with the 19th century paradigmatic shift, which meant any form of conservatism affirms that some segment of space and time in the past brings the answers to something. This flies in the face of the whole paradigm. Nothing from the past is an answer to the present. Opens us up. See, we've got to figure out how we get openness, see, to new so-called old New Age and stuff like that.
With Popper's thesis, that would be the same kind of conflict in science.
Well, it is because he's an evolutionary epistemologist. He is not an empiricist. And so that's why Popper and Kuhn are fundamental enemies, because that the mind is self-correcting. Well, that's partly correct. Partly correct. History of thought is demonstration that the mind corrects many of its errors. Some people's errors. See, but every error in every mind isn't corrected. Some people go on holding error till they die. But the structure of the mindset in a culture has changed. But every person in that culture isn't changed. But most individuals do not determine the flow of a culture, for good or ill. So when the church has revival, it controls the flow. When naturalistic humanism controls the flow. And private little parties at church won't affect the flow. Except, where it goes on, it'll be fine, but it won't control the moves. So these are very important on the way to materialism. That's what this will be. And materialism will stem from the physics of Hobbes and Descartes. And unless someone's just particularly interested in that, on the way, Berkeley responds with his idealism. See, esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived, and this is the Berkeleyan, not Berkeley, but Berkeleyan idealism. Bishop Berkeley responded to the positivism of the day with idealism. Well, that's not exactly the source of explaining the nature of science, so that wasn't too good. So the ultimate consequence, he thought he preserved God talk by removing materialism. See, if to be is to be perceived, he placed reality in perception. He's on the way to relativism and didn't know it. See, he thought he was protecting ultimate reality, and the very move he made, he opened up the world, not just to Berkeleyan immateriality in physics, but he opened up the world that the human mind constitutes reality.
Maybe similar to the Greeks.
Yes, you can't make a move like that. But he was positive he was trying to protect the Bible and God against what was self-evident, deadly moves in science against God. But that's why it's very deadly, because it's destructive of the Christian enterprise as well as science. So his answer wasn't helpful. So it's very important to see why it's not helpful. See, as Descartes thought he was trying to be helpful. His intention was, it's just like Bultmann, his intention is to be helpful. But intentionality doesn't necessarily determine the outcome. See, the integrity of a person need not be discussed necessarily. but we can tell the outcomes of these.
How does he relate to that category of primary and secondary qualities?
Well, if you read just a simple couple of chapters to catch up on this, what this does is an empiricism over against math. Now, math was the primary categories, and math dealt with matter. And in the secondary, that's where you get relativism. Relativism in aesthetics, relativism in morals, relativism. But see, only matter is primary, and matter and math here. And this shows up in Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, primary and secondary qualities. And some people think that this development in microscopic physics is primary and secondary, but I think that that's not true. But primary and secondary qualities, these are the arbitrary or the relative. This is the absolute universal.
So he just incorporates that into an idealistic model?
Yes, yes. So this is a good hurried place. Not a dumb place, but the Metaphysical Foundation has two very powerful chapters showing this
Would
development.
that be similar to Husserl?
Well, Husserl, see, phenomenology comes out of the dilemma from Kant forward. That Husserl was trying to get out of materialism. See, phenomenology is a direct attack on materialism.
But he uses a mathematical model.
Yes, his doctoral thesis was in that. And it was concerned with the ontological status of numbers. That was a dumb thesis, wasn't it? What makes any difference? Well, it has difference because if the language of nature is mathematics arbitrary? If mathematics is found to be arbitrary, see, it's found to be limited but not arbitrary. That's what Gödel's theorem demonstrated. Mathematics is limited but not arbitrary. It is not self-grounding but not arbitrary. So Husserl asked the right question. He was searching for certitude without taking the positivistic, materialistic line. So he was trying to expand realism. He would claim to be a realist rather than an idealist, but he winds up only an idealist. Okay, giants, come forward here and we'll listen to these reports. These are very important matters. And who next time, as they're making their way, passing out among us? This mine or yours? Do you have any more? Praise God.
Well, I had the introductory chapter of Cohen. As you know, the title is self-explanatory for the subject matter. He's trying to figure out how the term revolution can be used as a category for interpreting what's taken place in science historically. What's happened is there are people who've had different views of how they should categorize it, and he sort of takes Kuhn's approach and says that revolution is the appropriate method or the appropriate model for looking at the changes that have taken place. And that's basically the thrust of the book, to figure out chronologically what's taken place. And as you read it, he gets sort of bogged down in a lot of historical facts and dates and things like that. And I think understanding the introduction helps you to put all of that into perspective, because he gives a paradigm, I guess, for revolutions. He sees I guess, twofold, basically. Intrinsic model, Newton, Darwin, Einstein, we see the impact of them both scientifically and culturally. But also we see the relevance in clarifying, and that is just looking at it and saying that I can clarify this information as revolutionary